Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Eva van Passel, and I will quickly run you through the program for the evening. Of course, you all know that we are here to listen to Ivan Krastev. I don't really have to explain that to you. But what you may have missed is that after the lecture, we will also invite two discussants on stage with Ivan Krastev. And we are delighted that Heather Grabba from the Open Society European Policy Institute and Jorg Kustermans from the University of Antwerp agreed to be here with us. I will introduce them in more detail before the panel. So we will have an open discussion with also room for questions from the audience. But before that, I would like to welcome our own Evans Foundation's executive president on stage, Monique Cantos-Perber, because she will introduce Ivan Krastev to you and also will tell you all a little bit more about the Evans Lecture Series initiative. Please welcome Monique Cantos-Perber.
So, ladies and gentlemen, as the Evans Foundation Executive President, I am delighted to welcome you all this evening for the second edition of the Evans Lectures Series. As you may know or may not know, the Evans Foundation is a public foundation with offices in Antwerp, Paris, and Warsaw. And the purpose of our foundation is to reassess what living together in Europe really means in our contemporary society. With the events the Foundation organizes, we want to strengthen our commitment to open and free public debate on the challenges that Europe is facing. In our lectures series, renowned speakers from different backgrounds are asked to reflect on the core topics which are at the basis of our foundation. First, how to foster a common European purpose through differences of background, differences of nationality, differences of culture, differences in values, and norms and values in the European reality. And our speakers have talked or will talk about these challenges from their own background and expertise. In September, we welcome Professor Michael Ignatieff, the president of the Central European University in Budapest. And tonight, we are honored to introduce Ivan Krastev. Ivan Krastev is the chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies, an independent NGO and think tank in Sofia, and he is a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Amongst several positions in international boards and councils, he is also a well-known opinion maker and writer. And I especially recommend his latest book, After Europe, Le Destin de l'Europe, which is a very important contribution to the European debate. Ivan Krastev has published, as I said, many essays and books on democracy and Europe, and he has only recently returned from a stay in the US at the Henry Kissinger Chair in Foreign Policy and International Relations at the Library of Congress. We are thrilled that he is here with us this evening, and the topic of his lecture is fascinating because he will be talking about the age of imitation and its discontent. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ivan Krastev.
Thank you very much. What I have learned from staying as a Kissinger chair was the famous quote from Kissinger is that people go to these talks for the pleasure of being introduced. It sounds so good always. But also, I'm very thankful for you being here, and because I know some of the people in the room, for me it's real privilege, and also knowing Michael Ignatieff very well. I know that following him is not going to be easy, but at least you believe that being in the same group is great. So what I'll try to do is, I have been working on a book which, if everything is fine, is going to be published next year with a colleague of mine, American professor Stephen Holmes, which is about imitation, and basically post-1989 thought in the key of imitation and resentment that it produced. But what I'm going to do is I'll try basically to connect it to some of the problems that European Union is facing today and to try to reflect on this. So let's start with a story that at least the rumor has it that Gary Grant, a very famous Hollywood actor from mid-20th centuries, once went to a charity party, but he has forgotten his invitation. And there was this lady, very tough lady, who was basically checking the invitations. So he said, do you know what, I have forgotten my invitation. She said, no invitation, you cannot enter. But he said, I'm Gary Grant. She looked at him and she said, you do not look like Gary Grant. And then he famously said, nobody looks like Gary Grant. And this is true. I'm saying this because part of the problem, and I do believe this is quite important when we're talking about the crisis that the European Union is facing today, is to understand to what extent we're talking about a normal crisis in which the political ideal view of a certain political project is clashing with a certain reality, so nobody is a Gary Grant in life in the way he's Gary Grant on the screen, or to what extent basically we're facing a political crisis that is touching on a much more fundamental issues that are questioning the very basics of the European projects. And this is not going to be an easy question to answer, because I do believe that this crisis has a different dimensions for different peoples and, to be honest, in different countries. But what I'm going to argue in front of you today is that European Union, as we know today, at least in my view, is composed of three different Europes that have been historically three different European projects that have been developing and coexisting. And I'm going to argue that all of them, in a certain way, are cast in doubt, and basically we're going to force to rethink them in order to go ahead. The first is the post-war Europe. And this is post-1948, 45 Europe, and a lot of talk, of course, has been said about the Europe as a peace project. But one of the most important elements of this type of a post-war Europe was two things. First, that it was very much rooted in the shared memories of the World War II. Don't forget that all of the founding nations of the European Union represented basically the nations that in one way or the other have been defeated during the war. The United Kingdom, the only kind of a victorious power, didn't join in the beginning. But at the moment, this type of a cementing power of a shared memories are fading away, and we should not be surprised by this, because psychologists have been always arguing that keeping certain memory for more than 3 generations is very difficult, nevertheless how much you're trying to institutionalize it. So the survivor generation of the World War II is not here anymore. Secondly, because of the much more diverse nature of our societies, for many of the non-Europeans coming to Europe, when they talk about war, they don't refer to the World War II. For the Syrians, basically coming to Europe today, war means Aleppo does not mean the destruction of Dresden or the destruction of Warsaw. So from this point of view, this is also a different reality. But the second part of the Europe as a post-war project was that, and this was paradoxical in the Cold War, this was a post-war project that all the time was thinking about war. And not simply about the war, but about nuclear war. Because the Cold War, Europe was the major theater of the Cold War, and the idea that the war can come and probably Europe is going to be first destroyed, this was a very interesting moment in which the post-war project was very much aware of war. What changed after 1989 is, for the first time, peace is taken for granted. And peace is taken for granted so much, not simply by the population, but also by the policymakers, that for almost 30 years, European political elites managed to convince themselves that if not in world, at least in Europe, the military power doesn't matter anymore. So this is why I do believe that the Russian-Ukrainian crisis and the Russian annexation of Crimea came as such a shock, because certainly you start to realize that probably military power still matters, but only under the conditions that you have it. The third element of this post-war Europe as a project is very much was that this post-war Europe was an American Europe. It was created by the United States. It was secured by the United States. And for the first time in this type of a post-war history, the relations between the United States and the European projects has been transformed. And of course, Mr. Trump can be easily blamed for this, but I do believe it goes slightly beyond Trump and it's much more structural in its nature. So for the first time, European Union cannot rely on the American security umbrella in the way it has been relying during the Cold War era or initially after the post-war period. And I do believe that in the coming years, as Mrs. President said, basically I'm just coming from the US, you're going to be surprised to what extent now China is behind in the back of mind of everything that America is doing. China is becoming, in the confrontation with China, the central organizing principle of the American foreign policy, and this is going very much also to affect the relations with the European Union and Europe. So you have all these three parts of the post-Europe project, and all of them cannot play the same role that they played before. Neither the shared memory, not peace being taken for granted, and basically the idea that only soft power matters, nor basically the American security umbrella in the same way it was. The second Europe that in my view was also constitutive part of the European Union as we know it is post-1968 Europe. And post-1968 Europe is the Europe of rights as we know them. And this is quite an important element because of course the legal scholars are going to tell us that the rights are as ancient as the world. But I'm much more going to side with the American scholar Samuel Moyn, who basically wrote a beautiful book called The Last Utopia, in which he's claiming, in my view persuasively, that what we are seeing in the 1970s is the disillusionment of part of the progressive part of our societies with the idea of the socialist utopia, the idea of remaking society on the socialist plan, brought back the idea of the human rights as the discourse and basically the framework in which the Western democracies start to function. And when we're talking about human rights, I'm going just to thread three important elements who are important for my talk. First, it was in 1960s and 70s, and it was also very much the reflection of what was happening in Eastern Europe, was that people started to talk about the state not simply as an instrument of protecting the rights, but also as basically threat to the rights. Secondly, rights were the rights of individuals, but also rights of the minorities, the most vulnerable groups. And thirdly, the rights were perceived not simply on the level of the nation state, but basically the idea of the rights were perceived as a kind of a global movement and a global frame. Why I'm saying all this? Because I do believe what we are seeing today with the rise of some of the far-right populist parties and others is not so much the change of the discourse on rights. Most of these people do talk rights. But we see a major cultural shift from a discourse which is based on the rights of minorities to the discourse based on the rights of majorities. So the major argument was the majority also have rights, and these rights has two most important expressions. First, it's up to majorities, and majorities the way they are basically represented in the democratic elections, that has the right to decide who can be part of the political community and who is not going to be. This is basically whom you're going to allow to be a citizen and who not. And secondly, under what kind of conditions. And I do believe this type of a shift to perspective from the minority rights to the majority rights has its explanation in the many things, starting with demography. It has something to do with the emergence of something that I'm calling threat on majority. Because of the demography, certain type of majority groups that starts to fear that in the next decades they're not going to be majorities anymore, and they basically don't believe anymore that their voting power is enough to protect the values and the identities they're rooted in. And I do believe this is a general cultural shift that is not going and cannot be explained simply with the rise of one party or one group of parties. The shift to the majority rights, I do believe, is going to affect the European policy in general, and how it's going to be dealt with this is quite important, and this is not by accident that people like Mr. Orban and others, they see basically the fight today very much as the fight against the legacy of 1968 than anything else. And the third Europe, and this is the Europe I'm going to focus on, which constitute the European Union, is the post-1989 Europe. And the post-1989 Europe was very much for the first time a unified Europe. This was a Europe that, put it kind of bluntly, was based on hard budgets and soft borders. I do believe that Russians were right to claim that the European Union was the only great power that in the post-Cold War period has been expanding its borders. The softness of the European borders were coming from the fact that the European Union rightly believed, at least 10 years ago, that we are all the time bordering future members. And this was the case with Turkey, which was an accession, the case with the Western Balkans, it was the problem with Ukraine. So from this point of view, talking about the borders of Europe as a kind of a strict and well-protected borders didn't make much sense if you're basically seeing a European project as the project of Europe which is enlarging itself. And secondly, it was critically important not to define these borders in cultural terms, because part of the attractiveness of the European project was exactly this. It was a value, it was a norm, it was a legal space. It was very much adherence to this. In a dramatic way, I do believe that several crises, Russian, Ukrainian, but particularly the migration crisis, is changing it. Because when today people are saying that we want strengthening of the borders of the European Union, the first question is that you should know exactly where these borders are. It's not simply about the nature of the borders. This is about who is in and who is out. And I'm saying this because, and here comes my imitation story, from this point of view, the migration crisis served and also revealed certain type of a clash between basically the Eastern Europe and Western Europe have been reacting to this, and there was a lot of talk about this, and it was a lot of interpretation. My major argument is going to be the following. If you see the number of people who came in Europe as a result of the Syrian war and basically 2015 crisis, keep in mind that this number is twice lower than the number of people that moved from Eastern Europe to Western Europe after the financial crisis of 2010-2009. So this is not the number of people. In a strange way, the impact of the refugee crisis can be compared with 9/11 in the United States. Because 3,000 people being killed in New York is a tragedy. In terms of numbers, this is not the biggest tragedy that the world has seen. But it forced the Americans to see the world with different eyes. And something similar happened in Europe. What Europeans realized is that in the world, which is now globalized, but which is extremely uneven in social and economic terms, in a world in which everybody knows how the others live, but some are living much better than others. If you want to change your life in one generation, and if you're living in a poor and badly governed country, better try to change the country than to try to change the government. The changes for radical change is going to be much stronger. And these Europeans reacted first to this because we were the first to do it. One of the interesting impact, which makes the 1989 revolution very much different than any previous revolution, is that as a result of every revolution, you have a movement of people outside of the countries that went through revolutions. But normally the people leaving was the defeated party. It was the white Russians that left Russia after 1917. It was the white French that left after the French Revolution. 1989 revolution was the first in which it was the winning party. Those who are very much waiting the change and celebrating the change were the first to leave, and for a very logical reason. For the first time, the utopia, the project, was not somewhere in the future. The revolution of 1989 was under the idea that we want to be a normal society. And being a normal society means be like the West. So from this point of view, the future was not ahead in time, it was just next in Spain. And if the future of Bulgaria is Germany, why to wait while Bulgaria is going to become like Germany and not to go to Germany? From this point of view, opening of the borders was the major change, and this was also the most celebrated change for all of East Europeans. I'm saying this because before going to the problem of imitation and how it explains some of the East-West divide that we see it, I'm going to make a point which I also made in the book, but for me this is one of the most under-analyzed point when it comes to some of the problems that Eastern Europe is facing now, both in the way we are voting for certain type of governments, but also in the way we're relating to the European project. When people in the West and the East talk about building walls, we are talking about very different walls at the end of the day. In the West, the far-right parties are talking about the walls that are going to stop foreigners from coming. In the East, it's much more talk about building a wall, stopping your own people from living. The trauma of the major exodus of people from Central and Eastern Europe is one of the things that extremely strongly influence the political climate and the vote distribution in our countries. And let's give you some figures in order to imagine the scale of the problem we're talking about. After 1989, almost 1/3 of the population of the Baltic republics has left. Now they're studying, working, living outside of their countries. Only for the last 10 years, 3.6 million Romanians has left Romania, 3/4 of them under 35-year age. You're going to see in many Bulgarian figures are the following. Starting with 1989, Bulgaria has lost 21% of its population. And if you have this impact combination between the aging population and the exodus of people, demographic projections predict that we're going to lose 27% more of our population in the next 30 years. So in a certain way, you have this major exodus of people that has three distinctive impact on the way Eastern Europe functions. First, there is an economic impact of it. It's not simply that some of the more entrepreneurial people are living, and in the beginning we are just looking at the remittances and the money which they're bringing back to their own countries, but one of the interesting stories is that all money invested in their education are living with them. So as a result of it, you have a major transfer of money from the East to the West because of the investment being done in the education of these people. And here comes the policy trap for the governments in the region. The more you invest in education, the better your secondary schools are, the easier people are living. 78% of the graduates of the 20 best Bulgarian schools even do not apply for Bulgarian universities. And this type of an economic dimension is quite important because as a result of it, it's not simply that people are living, but certain important structural, infrastructural kind of part of your society are particularly damaged. These days, in Central and Eastern Europe, it's much easier to find an honest politician than a nurse. And this is the health center, basically the health system, which is most touched by this. And imagine what is happening about society, which is aging, and basically demand for this type of health services are very high. And this explains one of the major paradoxes of Eastern Europe. When you're listening to the discourse of some of the governments in the region, you're going to imagine that they are not going to allow a single foreigner to enter their country. So here's the figures. Never in the history of Eastern Europe, more foreigners has come to work in Poland than under the last years under the peace government. Almost 2 million are basically mostly Ukrainians, but now also Filipinos and Pakistanis who are going to Poland simply because the labor market is doing this. And this is quite important because from this point of view, in Western Europe, one of the major discourses we open to refugees because these are the most vulnerable groups and we have a moral obligation for them and we basically should decide what we're doing with the migrants. In Eastern Europe, it's opposite. In a certain way, we're much more open to migrants because to migrants you do not have moral obligations. You basically decide whom you want, you see the economic interest of their staying, you're not putting kind of additional funding on this. What we're close very much is about refugees. And I'm saying this because in order to understand part of the nationalist rhetoric coming from Central and Eastern Europe, you should keep exactly this. the number of people living is becoming the major threat for the economic model of the region. More people has left Hungary after Viktor Orban came to power than after 1956. I'm saying this because plus this economic dimension, there is a political dimension. People who are not living in their own countries tend not to vote so actively, nevertheless, that Romanian presidential elections in a certain way were slightly exception on this. So as a result of it, the electoral body is changing. And the electoral body is changing because most of the people that you expect to vote for change are not there anymore. So you have a very strong bias, and also this is very much based on, you have an increasing weight, electoral weight, for less mobile groups, for older people, for people basically who has less opportunities to this. And this explains one of the characteristics of Central and Eastern Europe. If you have in mind that the young people, in general, is a small cohort in the region because of the demographic reasons, and many of them basically expect to leave the country after a certain period of time, then you're going to understand why in Eastern Europe you're going to see much more young people protesting on the streets than people going and voting. If you're not sure that you're going to stay, your relations basically to your country is different. And the third is the psychological aspect of this exodus of people. I have been always comparing for myself what we're seeing in our parts of the world with what happened to some of the rural areas of our member states in 70s and 80s, where a lot of people basically moved to the cities. Even if you have a much better life in Plovdiv, Sofia, or Burgas, your success is put into question by the very fact that you are succeeding in a place that many of your friends wants to leave, wants to exit. And I'm making this point because this explains one of the most important, in my view, dilemma to understand the populist turn in Central and Eastern Europe. Unlike in the South Europe, where the explanation is very much rooted in the economy, and as a result of it, I do believe this city deals very well with any problem that has an economic explanation. Brussels knows how to understand something that is rooted in the economy. But economy cannot explain you why Poland decided to vote for a liberal government, because not simply for the last 10 years, Poland was the best performer as an economy in the European Union, but even people who are going to say economic growth is not everything, it's about social inequality. The data shows that in the last 10 years, the social inequality in Poland have been declining and not increasing, unlike in many other countries. And thirdly, 77% of the Poles declared that they are satisfied with their personal life. So explain me then, when after these figures, you're going to have basically a public which are voting for a government which is quite critical to the European Union. Adam Przeworski, one of the famous political theorists, Polish origin, working in the US for the last 50 years, when he was asked how he's going to explain the liberal turn in Poland, he said, theoretically speaking, this should not have happened. And here comes the last part of my lecture and my explanation, this about imitation. So how to explain why Central and Eastern Europe, which was not so strongly affected by the financial crisis as the Southern Europe, in a certain way ended up with these regimes. And I'll start with 1989. And my argument is going to be that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Europe was looking like a stage on which everything was set up for the performance of George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion. I don't know, do you know the place, but it's a beautiful place from the beginning of the 20th century, and this is the story of a poor flower girl who was speaking a Cockney English, huge problem, and she met this professor in phonetics who said that he can learn in several months her to speak like a queen, and basically she's going to be accepted in a high society and nobody is going to know that she is who she is. And this happened. It was a great success. She went on a cocktail party. Nobody recognized that she is not part of this society. And of course, most of the audience expected that she's going to marry the professor, but then George Bernard Shaw made a huge issue saying she should not do this, because the moment when She starts to speak like a queen. She wants to be treated like the queen. And this was not what the professor was ready to do it. So we expected everybody that because in a certain way, this type of a Pygmalion story was what some colleagues are going to say norm diffusions. This was the Europeanization. This was all this conditionality in which Central and Eastern Europe basically was adopting European legislation, European ways of life, and basically trying to learn to speak in the way that you're going to become part of the high society. But what happened was that, particularly after 2015, when you're watching the last final act of the play, it appeared that you're not watching Pygmalion anymore. You're watching a different story. You're seeing basically the theater staging of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is not anymore the story of the flower girl that learned how to speak like a high society lady, but basically this is the tragic story of somebody who wanted to replicate himself and created a monster that basically goes after him and his family and trying to destroy him. And I do believe part of the story, and particularly part of the panic in European Union concerning the shift of Central and East European democracies to the illiberal way, and particularly the way Mr. Orban is talking about illiberal democracy, was that suddenly West Europeans recognize that in the East, and particularly in the case of Hungary, you have an illiberal monster which is composed by liberal elements. And I'm going to give you the example which is probably better known to people that have been doing either media law or Hungary. When Hungary adopted its media law that has been strongly criticized by both human rights organizations in Brussels for being violating the rights of expression and being perceived as much more repressive. Basically, the Hungarian government said, but do you know what? Every single article of this legislation has a precedent in one or the other of the member states. We are not doing anything that others are not doing. And then suddenly you realize that for the first time, this type of idea of a model, the problem of the imitator, start to look for you as a kind of a forecast for things that you don't want to happen. But why it happened that Central and Eastern Europe, which was so keen on imitating the West, which was the free choice of our society to join the European Union, to adopt the legislation, to become part of the European family, where the resentment comes from. And as I said, this time it's not the economy stupid. And what we are claiming also is basically Stephen Holmes in our book is that one of the important stories that after 1989, the world was not divided anymore between the Democrats and communists, between the liberal and conservative. The major divide was between the imitated and the imitators. But being an imitator, psychologically, is a painful experience. Particularly is the development of time. First, you have the feeling that you're losing your own identity. But secondly, what is even much more important, all your success is judged from outside. It's always the model telling you how well you're doing. This is asymmetrical relationship. It is a power relationship. It very much resembles the relations between the creditor and the debtor, which we saw in the South. And in the case of Central and Eastern Europe, it was not simply imitating the West, it was very much imitating Germany. And I'm going to give you 4 reasons why, for Central and East Europeans, imitating Germany was not so easy. The first was imitating Germany very much was about imitating the way Germany is dealing with nationalism. Because in a certain way, Germany transition from dictatorship to democracy was the model that was in front of the eyes of everybody. And if you go basically back to the 1990s, you're going to see how much it was talked. But Germany's relations with nationalism was very exceptional. For the Germans, every type of extreme nationalism was directly leading to Nazism. As a result of it, in the post-war German political culture, nationalism, even if its milder forms, have been de facto criminalized, because this is what Germans learned from their history. For the Poles, for the Hungarians, it was not as easy to deal with the nationalism this way for very obvious reasons. First, these countries have been very much basically the product of the national uprising when the European empires have been collapsing. But secondly, the nationalist was very important of the anti-communist bloc that won in 1989. When people today are attacking Mr. Kaczynski, I can say one thing about Mr. Kaczynski, which is true. He never changed his views. What he believed in 1980s, he believes the same. There was the nationalistic part of solidarity movement, which was much more conservative, which was much more there, and they have been there from the beginning. And the fact that in 1990s we didn't hear much about them was that because of the Yugoslav wars, this type of a post-communist nationalism was very much related to the communism and the post-communism. Milosevic became the face of this nationalism, and for this kind of an anti-communist part, it was very difficult to identify with this. For them, it was not their party, but they have been always there. And I have been looking through a lot of public opinion polls showing that in a certain way the problem was not where this type of a nationalism comes from. The question is where it has been hiding before, because it was there. The second reason why it was not easy to imitate Germany was that because of the fact that in Germany Hitler came to power through elections, Germany did a lot in order basically to constrain exactly the majoritarian nature of the democratic regimes. No tolerance for referendums and a high support for the non-majoritarian institutions like the independent central bank and the constitutional court. These are the two most respected institutions by the German public. But for East Europeans, coming from a period in which the major change in their political life is the fact that they can vote and elect their government, for them the idea of the sovereignty and the idea of democracy was very much connected to the executive. And if you can see, one of the major common characteristics of all this regime is that they basically believe that democracy is the executive power. And the separation of power is alibi for the elites not to do what people are asking them to do. And I do believe this type of a different history and experience was quite important to understand it. The third reason also why it was not easy to become Germans for Central and East Europeans was that Germans were trying to teach them not exactly what they did during their transition, but what they do believe they should have done. And I'm going to give you the classical example. In the period 1950 to 1968, denazification was not part of the German model. In a certain way, it was much more amnesia about the Nazi period, and this explains why in 1968 the young German generation started to ask the questions about what their parents have been doing. Germans believed this was wrong, exactly because they remember 1968, so they decided that they're going to go with the illustration immediately after the change. But from the point of view of some of these Germans, this was not about historical justice, it was very much about purging of the old elites, the Aussie elites. And this explains one of the major characteristics of Germany voting these days. AfD in eastern part of Germany is much more rejection and response to the way the unification took place than simply basically to the refugee flow, because if you see basically the number of the refugees in the eastern provinces, this is much lower than almost anywhere in Germany. So from this point, and the fourth one is that there was one thing that Germany and all West European countries, for good reasons, decided not to export to the East, and this was the welfare system, because they do believe that basically in this type of a much more globalized economy, simply East European societies could not afford the type of the welfare capitalism that was typical for the West during the Cold War. As a result of it, in many countries, particularly in some of the conservative parts of Central and East European society, the idea was, it is not the model that we wanted to imitate. Polish conservative right said, we liked the West during the Cold War because they believed in God, why the communists basically didn't, and now the West is about gay marriages and secularism. I'm giving all these examples to you because if you're going to listen carefully to the political rhetoric of Mr. Orban or Mr. Kaczynski or some of the other East European parties, you're going to see that their major battle cry is, we don't want to imitate the West anymore. We want to be ourselves. As Mr. Orban said, we want to be in the way we have been 11 centuries ago. I was always saying that I'm really admiring his memory, basically remembering so well how it was. But this idea that our identity is very much based on being different. Maria Schmidt, one of the famous and important figure in the Hungarian right, was saying, we don't want to imitate the Germans and the French anymore. We don't want to be lectured by them anymore. So this idea of resentment against imitation is coming as a major problem for the European Union, because the very idea of the European enlargement was exactly based on the idea that you have the new member states which are trying to adopt, to imitate, to adjust to the rules, to the norms of the community that they're getting. I'm going to my last part, and this is very much what you're doing with European Union in the moment in which post-war Europe is in question, post-1968 Europe is in question, and post-1989 Europe is in question because of the tensions between the East and the West of Europe, which we're seeing these days. When it comes to the post-war Europe, I really do believe that the European Union cannot allow itself anymore to take peace for granted. And it's not about this symbolic talk about the European army and so on, which I don't know exactly what it means, but for the first time, I do believe that there should be a serious question in the European Union what it will take for the European Union to be capable to defend itself. In my view, it's very much a question that particularly goes to Germany, and this is not simply about military budgets. This is also about certain type of a cultural change in which you cannot believe anymore that the world is a secure place. If you remember the global security doctrine of the European Union from 2003, the first sentence was, Europe never was more secure, prosperous, and free in its history. Secure, at least, cannot be put anymore. So in a certain way, the security question should come as an important question. And from this point of view, it's up to the European Union to constitute itself as a community of faith. People should have the clear identity that in a certain way, this is about defending your way of life, is not to be defended by somebody else, which is not against neither NATO nor alliances with the United States, just the opposite. But even as it's quite clear, the alliance with the United States are going to be very much depends on the defense capability of Europe itself. When it comes to the majority rights and the shift in the European politics, basically the crisis of post-1968 Europe, I tend to believe, and I could be wrong, that in many respects, what we are seeing very much reminds me of the crisis of the European liberal democracies in the late 1960s and early 1970s. This is a period now people like to compare with the 1930s. I'm not a great fan of these comparisons because this was societies which were composed of ex-soldiers, and this was society in which both radical left and radical right believed in the purification and transformative power of violence, which for the moment at least is not the case now. But 1970s was a very important moment for West European societies, and there was a major political turmoil. For example, on the level of violence, political violence, if you're going to see back, you're going to see how much of it was in West Germany, in Italy, Red Army faction, Red Brigades. Why I'm saying this? Because then there were many young people, the new generation, coming from the university, seeing a major also demographic change in which this generation was coming, that were putting into questions the political status quo, the mainstream parties, basically the values of the previous generation. And at this moment, I do believe that center-left succeeded to do something that was of great importance. They managed to integrate some of the legitimate concern of this new generation. Environmental concern was one of it, but it was also basically democratization of social life, relations between sexes, relations between different generations. At the same time, they managed to basically de-radicalize and try to cast the basically radical part of this movement from these much more legitimate concerns. In 1971, 1/3 of the population of West Germany was supportive to the major demands of the Red Army faction. 10 years later, basically, Red Army faction was a marginal player in the German politics, while at the same time, the Social Democratic Party of Germany and the New Green Party managed to get representation to these people. I do believe that the major, from this point of view, challenge to Europe today is the center-right in Europe today capable of do the same with some of the pressure that comes on the liberal system from the far right? Could basically they be ready to find and basically distinguish some of the legitimate concerns of their voters from kind of an open xenophobic and anti-liberal agenda that comes from. And I'm going just to give one example. For me personally, the demand for control over the borders is a legitimate demand. The total anti-diversity rhetoric coming from some of these parties, I don't find legitimate. But how you're making these distinctions, how basically you distinguish between the right of the people to know that their government is in charge of who belongs and who does not belong to the community, and at the same time to try to isolate the openly xenophobic and racist part of society, for me it's critical. And then I'm ending with the relations between Eastern and Western Europe. Honestly speaking, and probably I'm a minority here, I don't believe that the relations simply can continue as the West basically trying to tell the East Europeans, you're not doing well, you should change this, you should change that. Because unfortunately in our countries there is a constituency much bigger than the populist parties which fear this as a kind of a second-class citizenship. There is a beautiful short Hungarian film which in my view can be a great illustration of this. And this is the story, it's called Sing. It got an Oscar for a short movie, and the story is beautiful, in fact. This is it's 1990s, it's Budapest, and the girl goes to a new school, and she was very much attracted by this school because she wants to sing in the choir. It was a very, very famous choir. And she was, of course, accepted in the choir, but because she was not singing particularly well, and at the same time the choir was competing to go for the excursion to Sweden, the teacher asked the girl only to open her mouth. She said, listen, it's very important, we should win this competition, so you're going to be on the stage, but do not think, just open your mouth. And then her friend learned about this, and she got absolutely scandalized, and she started talking to other kids, and it appeared that she was not the only one that was silenced. So in a very powerful last scene of the film, when the competition starts, all the kids are simply opening their mouths without singing, and they start singing only when the teacher left. I'm saying this because the fear of a second-class citizenship is present in Central and Eastern Europe, and it is also very much fueled by history, by a lot of experiences. I do believe the talk of some of the West European politicians today also contributing to this, and I'm going to give an example with a progressive political figure. When Mr. Macron was making his famous post directive and saying that European truck drivers, when they're driving through the territory of France, should get the minimum wage, I do believe he could have done it in the way that is going to be very attractive for Central and East Europeans. It was enough for him to say, listen, I found this humiliating, that these people, who are one of us, are going to be paid differently when they're on the French territory. They're underpaid. But he didn't say this. He said, I'm doing this in order to defend the French workers. So policies is not only what you ask the government to do, but also how you are justifying your actions. And I do believe that this is only a kind of understanding that now, when all these countries are part of the European Union, have their institutional positions and can destroy the European project, if basically they feel totally disillusioned and disappointed, it's a time to basically reinvent this type of a not formal equality, but equality of experience. And I'm saying this, and I'm going to finish on something much more optimistic. Just to believe that Eastern European and Central Europe is lost for the European Union is wrong. I don't know a single country or political leader in Central and Eastern Europe, including Mr. Kaczynski and Mr. Orban, who believed that their country are going to be better outside of the European Union. Even more, Poland for me very much resembles the United States. It's a very divided society. You have a very strong kind of liberal Poland, which is also there. And this liberal Poland did well on the local elections, and to be honest, I do believe it's going to do well on the European elections. But even this Poland, which is pro-European and liberal, has the fear of being treated as a second-class citizenship. So from this point of view, the age of imitation is over. In a certain way, this is accepting with all these problems and sensitivities that Central and Eastern Europe is part of the European family, and nevertheless how Cockney our English still is, we should learn to talk to each other on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Don't run too far because we're expecting you right back on stage together with our two discussants who will give a first reaction or comments to the speech, and then we will open the floor for further discussion after that. So our first discussant is Heather Grabba. She's director of the Open Society European Policy Institute and director of EU Affairs there. From 2004 to 2009, she was senior advisor to the European Commissioner then for Enlargement, Olli Rehn. And before joining the Commission, she was deputy director of the Center for European Reform, a think tank based in London, where she published widely on this theme of EU enlargement and other European issues. Her writing has appeared in many renowned outlets, and she also has an academic background in teaching as well as research at institutions such as LSE, Oxford University, Birmingham University, and the European University Institute. And then our second discussant will be Jorg Kustermans. He works at the University of Antwerp as assistant professor in international relations in the Department of Political Science. So both of our discussants have an academic background and a lot more than that. Apart from for the University of Antwerp, he has also worked as a researcher for the Flemish Peace Institute and the Catholic University of Brussels. His PhD research focused on the notion of democratic peace, and he has published widely on issues ranging from the challenges of democracy and governance, over international citizenship, modernity in a postmodern world, to boredom and violence. So I'm very much looking forward to their comments and to the discussion, so please join me on stage for the panel. Thank you. I will suggest that Heather takes the floor first, but you can start with a drink of water. That's always a good way to start.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to see you all here this evening. And it's especially apt that Ivan has delivered his lecture here at the Beaux-Arts, where the perfect complement to listening to him this evening is to go and see the exhibition After Klimt. Because the exhibition actually illustrates many of the points that he made here this evening. Both artistically, how much there was an imitation of the style, for example, of painting developed in Paris before the First World War and afterwards, which was then copied in various parts of Central Europe and then adapted, improved, made Central European. But then the way that socialist realism, for example, was then imported back to Western Europe. And during that period, 1989 to 38, which the exhibition covers, there was more fluidity. It was before the ossification of the post-war, the post-Second World War, communist Europe. And of course, it was the period during which many of the ghosts of history that are still roaming around Central European politics were first let out of the box. So it was the period when Hungary became independent. In fact, there's an amazing painting in the exhibition of the coronation of the very last Austro-Hungarian emperor, who then subsequently disappeared. That was in 1916. And then it also, there's a painting of the election of the first democratically elected president in Central Europe. So I really recommend that, because what we're talking about here, what Ivan has been talking about this evening, is something that really is something that is still alive in politics today, which has enormous historical resonances. And I think what was very interesting, he started off by saying, look, a historical memory cannot last more than 3 generations. But what's remarkable about politics in Central Europe today is how many politicians are trying to create memories that may never have been there in the first place. So think about the way that Hungarian history textbooks, the textbooks that are used to teach Hungarian children, still very much maintain Trianon as the great national trauma, as the great wound that has never been healed. And the way that that is still used as a very fundamental a grievance, not only by the far right in Hungary, but by many parties, in fact, as a reason why the Hungarian Hungarian nation is still under threat. You see it in the speeches, particularly those made in Hungarian, of Viktor Orbán. And this idea of, another point that Ivan made, of the shrinking of the Hungarian nation, both demographically, because Hungary has one of the lowest birth rates in Europe, as well as the largest number of people who have left, particularly the young people. But this idea that we lose our distinctive language, and that the Hungarians outside our borders are our only hope. So this idea of the wound of Trianon, which in the 1990s, ironically, Viktor Orbán himself, as a young liberal, because remember that Fidesz was a liberal party originally, it was a member of ALDE before switching to the EPP. As a young liberal, Viktor Orbán himself, among many others, made the claim that, you know, joining the European Union was the answer to the wound of Trianon, that joining the European Union was a way of Hungary reuniting all of the Hungarian speakers because the borders wouldn't matter anymore. The Hungarians who were left abroad in Romania, Slovakia in particular, still not Serbia and Ukraine, but Romania and Slovakia, would be part of the European family, that the borders issue wouldn't matter, the Transylvanians would not be cut off because they would all be citizens of the European Union. Now, there's a very different story going on, which draws on a very different resonance of history. And so I think we have to look at the way that these traumas of history are reshaped, recreated, and used politically. They are manipulated and used politically, as they always have been. You know, it's not just the 11th century, it's also the recent experience that's there. So this sustaining of particular historical memories and reusing them is very important. Another one that's very interesting is the way that the internationalist story about Central Europe that was promoted during the communist period kind of disappeared after 1989. So the idea of the international brotherhood of socialist countries, and the fact that, for example, I know personally Polish doctors who went to work in Libya in the 1980s because that was, Czechs who went to work in Cuba because in that period it was seen as being part of an internationalist socialist brotherhood. That completely disappeared after 89, and the only internationalism was Europe. The only internationalism was the United States and NATO and the European Union. And that may also have something to do with the turn inwards that has happened, that the nationalism has become very much a turn inwards. And of course, the European Union, EU membership, did not resolve the issues of the nation. The EU membership was all about the state. It was not about the nation, and it wasn't about borders really very much. So if you look at the accession process of joining the European Union, that was definitely a process of imitation, as Ivan has been saying. It was a whole-scale importation of the EU's laws and policies and norms, changing constitutions and competition policy, right down to the finest grain of detail, even at local level in all of these countries. But there are two problems with the way that happened. In some respects, it's an enormous success story. It's extraordinary how that managed to ease the path of post-communist transition, helped, of course, by foreign direct investment and EU money and so on. But it made for a non-violent, relatively easy transition. And I wrote a book, I have to confess, that was published in 2006 called The EU's Transformative Power, Europeanization and Conditionality in Central Europe, 1989 to 2004. So I really wrote a book on this subject. I really believed in it. And it was a remarkable thing. But there were two things that were left out. One was public debate about the changes to the state. Because it was an elite-led project supported by EU money and EU rhetoric and all the rest of it, there wasn't a fundamental discussion about the different models that could be adopted, everything from competition policy to constitutions. It was, well, we'll adopt the EU model because we're going to join the EU and that's our future. And so as a result, when governments turned against these institutions that were created in the 1990s from, for example, the media regulator in Hungary or indeed the Supreme Court in Poland, there wasn't a very deep sense in society that these are institutions we created, we chose, and we want to defend. They had a very shallow foundation, and so when they were knocked by a ruling party, it was quite hard to stop them from toppling. And when the EU then came in to ride to their rescue, that sounded terribly like the 1990s all over again. And of course, there were things that were contested. There are things that, the Maui Konstytucja, for example, in Poland. But still, a lot of these institutions, the whole scale and very rapid change meant that they didn't develop deep local roots. So that was one problem with the process. And the other problem was that, as with most things the EU does, everything was settled by negotiations between elites. And here again, the imitation factor comes in, that the imitation of the way the EU operates worked, that basically the EU negotiated with the central executive. So it actually reinforced executive government, which, as Ivan was saying, is seen as the kind of heart of democracy. The EU negotiates with the prime minister and the ministers and the central ministries. And there was no real negotiation, certainly not with national parliaments, but also even with civil society. There wasn't really that much outreach. And that makes for a very shallow basis for a social consensus about the terms and conditions of entry to the EU. Maybe that was necessary because it had to be done quickly before the historical window of opportunity closed. I mean, there are many people in Serbia and Macedonia today who would love for their countries to have negotiated a very fast accession when they could have done so. Now they might never achieve it. I hope that was not the case, but that window of opportunity was there in the 90s, and these countries seized it. So it's always, the pluses and the minuses of going fast, going slow. But there's no question that, as Vojko Todorov, a very good political scientist in Bulgaria, puts it, negotiations between bureaucrats are not a really good basis for democratic consent. And that's what the accession process was about, which of course mimics, again, imitation, it mimics the way the EU itself negotiates, which is, between ministers. That's how the EU's working methods. But of course, there you have a much more detailed system of multi-level governance, which didn't really hold during the accession process. So I just wanted to finish by pointing out, the EU, of course, didn't settle the nation questions. It took borders for granted. One of the great shibboleths of the whole accession process was no changes in borders. You can still see this reflected in the debates now. The idea was we are not going to renegotiate borders in any way as part of this process. And so that meant that any remaining border issues were dealt with rather quickly, and they were kept really out of the public debate. And so when you have a fundamental debate about who belongs and who doesn't, Ivan's point, that was kind of not really discussed. There was a sense that where it was most discussed was, of course, in the Baltic states because of the Russophones, the Russian-speaking people who became rapidly citizens of Lithuania but took much longer to become citizens of Latvia and Estonia. There it was more discussed. But everything from the Beneš decrees to the question of historical minorities, this was not really settled. Perhaps it could not have been. You can't overload any process. But that meant that these unresolved issues of the nation have come back in the 2010s. They've come back in this decade. The state was settled. The state is still in question now a little bit in Poland, Hungary. But the nation, that's something it's much easier to whip up. It's much easier to raise that in national politics. So that's why I think the ghosts of history are still wandering around. And imitation is the worst way of settling a ghost.
Thank you, Heather. Jorg, I would look forward to your comments.
Yes. It's obviously difficult to comment on a lecture that one agrees with for the most part, because the idea with giving comments is that one is sort of critical of what has been said. But I should say that the lecture did in fact resonate with me a lot, and I think that especially the part on imitation, where I think that the central thesis that you make is that what we are witnessing today in countries in Central and Eastern Europe is that they refuse to imitate anymore, right? That it's they were imitating and now they say it's been enough, we refuse to imitate. And I recognize that a lot from interaction with people from Bulgaria more particularly, right? Where they say, look, why would we imitate your naivete? Right? You're being naive. Why should we imitate naive people? It's better that you imitate us because we are steeped in experience, and you should be imitating us rather than we imitating you. So that resonates a lot. But one thing that I do wonder about is the argument you make about imitation and how imitation breeds resentment. And it seems to be your argument that imitation breeds resentment always and necessarily, that there is something about the relationship between the one that is being imitated and the one that is imitating that always sort of feels bad for the one imitating. Right? I think that I teach international history, right? So I have to speak from that experience. I think that historically, at least in non-European history, early modern Asia, imitation was the game, basically. Korea imitated China, right? And Korea did not feel bad about imitating China, quite on the contrary. They felt good about imitating China because it helped them be a strong power within their own zone of influence. So they were within the zone of influence of China, but by imitating China, they developed their own zone of influence. In the late 19th century, yes, China refuses to imitate the West. It is forced to imitate the West. But Japan chooses to imitate the West. And it, much as Central and Eastern Europe, apparently chooses to imitate the West in the 21st century. And Japan does not necessarily feel resentment as a result of choosing to imitate the West. So I wonder, what is it about imitation? Or what is it about particular situations of imitation, right? Configurations within which imitation happens that breeds resentment in the imitator. I came up with a couple of, because your argument, if I understand it well, is that there is this recognition that one is morally inferior, this understanding that if one is imitating, then surely one must be morally inferior. And it's not nice to understand about yourself that you're morally inferior. The other thing is that you're judged by an outside party. You're not allowed to judge yourself anymore. It's always somebody else judging you on the basis of a model that they came up with. But that was the same in early modern Asia, right? It was China judging whether Korea was imitating sufficiently well. There was a clear moral hierarchy. There was an understanding also on the part of Korea that China was morally superior than Korea was. So it must be something else, right? Or something more, something. I came up with one possibility, but I don't actually believe that it's the right answer, right? So the one possibility is that maybe they imitate, but they feel or understand or think that they're not imitating very well, so that they're failing at imitation. They didn't even have to come up with their own model. They only had to imitate, but then they failed at imitation. That's pretty awful, right, if that's what you experience. The other possibility, which I think is more serious actually, is that imitation is experienced as problematic when it does not lead to higher status. So what you had in Korea, China, is that by imitating China, Korea achieved higher status. And it even achieved authority over its neighboring polities, small polities. What you have today in the late 20th century world, early 21st century world, is that imitation happens in an extremely closed environment. So as you say, the world is a global village, there's only global comparisons. But the fact that the world is a global village also means that there is by imitating, you don't achieve anything, because the world is filled up already with authoritative powers, with strong powers. So that seems to me a problem that Central Europe is experiencing, especially, I think, Hungary and Poland, because Hungary and Poland have this memory of actually being great powers. And I think that's why in Hungary and Poland probably it works out. The second, if I have time, 1 minute, half a minute, is what do we do about this? So is it even possible to have a policy? I think you're quite correct in saying the problem is that they have lost a sense of sovereignty, that they have lost a sense of sovereign agency. So how does one restore a sense of sovereign agency in a political environment where sovereignty doesn't exist anymore, right? And I think here, I like your sketch of the situation that Europe is facing today. And I actually think that the first problem, that peace cannot be taken for granted anymore, could actually be the solution. Because what it means is that countries of Central and Eastern Europe could actually have a real contribution to the European Union, a contribution that West Europe could recognize how does one restore sovereign agency? By recognizing not just that you have a legitimate complaint, but by recognizing that actually you have a real contribution to make to the project. Not simply imitating, but contributing to the project. That's a thought that came up as I listened.
Thank you very much, Ivan. I'll give you the chance to respond before.
Yeah, thank you very much. And genuinely, thank you very much, because both contributions were very important for me, because first Heather much better than me demonstrated not particular imitation, which is very much about imitation of institutions in a very short period of time, where the imitation is very much the rule of the game. So in a certain way, you go and you define yourself as an imitator at the moment when you ask for accession. Secondly, I do believe she was also extremely important stressing the elite dimension of this. In a certain way, the publics, the moment, and this is very important, support for the European Union traditionally was attraction to the model, but for example, in places like Bulgaria, trust in Brussels was very much the expression in mistrust of the national elites. And the idea was, we don't know what they're doing in Brussels, they cannot be worse than our own. So from this point of view, Brussels was perceived as an ally of society against the corrupt national elites, and this was also true in places like Greece, like Italy. It's not East European phenomena. But then comes the feeling, probably they're better, but do they care about us? And this is a critical story. And then your absolutely legitimate point of imitation. There is a famous 19th century French sociologist, Tardet, who said society is imitation. Basically, we imitate. This is the way we basically function. What is interesting about the Age of Imitations, in my view, is three things. First is, and this is also very much, René Girard developed it much stronger. It is one thing to imitate something that does not exist. Imitating Christ was very important for the religion, but by imitating Christ, you don't believe that you're going to be like Christ. From this point of view, what is quite important is that imitation is particularly painful in the world which is egalitarian in its values, and where originality is one of the major things about modernity. In 17th century, a famous American poet said, how it happens that we all are born originals and we die as copies. So the captive nations of Central and Eastern Europe starts to fear that they are copycat nations. In a certain way, the very much that you're imitating is making you more modern on one level, but being not original enough is becoming to question your own idea of how modern you are. And secondly, of course, the crisis of the model is quite important, because the interesting story about the Age of Imitation of about 1989 was that, unlike in the Cold War period, where basically your sovereignty was very much choosing whom to imitate. You can imitate the West, but you can imitate the Soviets, and basically you have this idea of choice. And this type of imitation and these tensions give you a idea that it was your choice. In a certain way, after 1989, the idea was that there was one remaining model and everybody should imitate it. And what happened was, and I do believe from this point of view, it is very important to distinguish between the imitation as a strategy to transform yourself, to become like somebody else, and imitation as a borrowing, where basically you're getting certain type of, be it technologies, being an institutions, but not in order because you want to be somebody else, but because you want to beat this somebody else. And I do believe from this point of view, China is an interesting story. In the post-1989 world, there was one country which never imitated, that only borrowed. And they made it very clear that not imitating the West was also part of their reform process. There was this beautiful story, a metaphor about the Chinese reform process, in which the story is you have the villages, two villages. One was plugging and cultivating the land with horses, and the other with zebras. And after a certain period of time, those who were doing this with zebras, they were doing better. So the problem of those living in the village with horses should decide what they do. And what they do was that first they decided to paint their horses to look like zebras, and said, oh, strangely enough, there are all these paintings appearing on our horses. And then basically they changed the horses with zebras, claiming that they're still horses. So from this point of view, the very fact that Chinese Communist Party decided to keep the party rule and this and that as part of its identity, why borrowing market, borrowing technologies, borrowing this and that, appeared to be the other model. And I found this quite important because this is what is distinguishing very much even East Europeans for whom imitation was transformation from this borrowing. In the book, we're doing quite a lot about Russia, which is a totally different story, where Russia imitation was much more the survival in a difficult environment. They never wanted to be like you, but basically this was the way to survive in the world that was imitating the West. But from this point of view, and I agree very much with both of you, for the self-esteem of some of the Central European nations, the idea of not imitating, being the model ourselves, is becoming critically important in this meaning of solidarity, of sovereignty. So this is why, strangely enough, post-populist Poland is going to have a totally different relations with the European Union, much more positive than simply basically the Poland that have been simply acceding. Because you have the fact that what happened was the choice, political choice within your own society. Because for the first time, European integration was contested. Post-1989, European integration was not contested. You don't have a major political parties which is going to be against it because there was no any other things to be modeled, to be copied. Now you have people who are there, and then the victory and the fact that you are staying is your victory. You suffered for this, you basically pay the price for this. So strangely enough, I do believe that when Central and East Europeans, and if they succeeded to find this kind of a new political identity after this illiberal turn, this is going to be a different type of liberalism. Because this is going to be a type of liberalism that was basically earned through the domestic political challenge. Of course, there is also an option that this type of illiberalism and not liberalism is going to go, because I don't believe that illiberalism is simply basically in the East. I do believe that there is Eastern Europe in every West European society. So from this point of view, but I very much agree with you, it's not simply imitation. Imitation is always going to be there. We're always going to imitate. But the idea of imitation as a source of political legitimacy of governments and society, I do believe this is over. And for me, this has political implications in the way Brussels talks to societies, Brussels talks to the states. Certain things that in 1990s were perceived as positive, the fact that you are lectured, because people had the feeling that the Brussels is lecturing their elites, now they have the feeling that they're lecturing them. And being lectured is not good, particularly if you're not in the university.
Thank you. We promised you that we would wrap up around 8, but we also promised you audience interaction. So I suggest we find a compromise and we do 1 or 2 short questions, please. Yes.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I thought it was going. Hello, my name is Alan Bowman. I'm from the mission of Canada to the EU, and I just wanted to very briefly thank the Evans Foundation for these events, and to recall that your last speaker, Michael Ignatieff, made another speech today in Budapest, sadly announcing that a large part of the Central European Universities' activities are moving to Vienna. So the call that he made to all of us last time, that somebody in Brussels, in Paris, or in Berlin do something, was not sufficiently heeded. It's not too late, and I just wanted to recall the difficulties that university, and to thank again the Evans Foundation for giving him a platform last time. But I do have a question for Dr. Krastev. I love your diagnostic. It's being very close. I'm from Canada, not of Central European background, but I'm very close to. I married a Central European, and I have an extended Central European family, and your message really resonates among people I know very well. But I like a prescription from the doctor, not just the diagnostic. So how do we go beyond it? And last year, President Juncker made a very powerful State of the Union speech, and not this year. He was quite nice this year too, but last year he talked about. We don't need concentric circles in Europe. We don't need two-speed Europe. We need to finish what we started, a common project where everybody gets in Schengen, everybody gets in the euro, everybody, like we do together. Is that the right tone for the Commission? Is that, or is something different needed? Thank you.
We will take one or two more questions and then Ivan can answer.
One of the questions I had is the one that was just asked. The other one, thank you for the insightful presentation as usual. My other question is, does it follow from your analysis that we should now allow member states to regain control over their borders as regards people, without giving them back control over their borders as regards goods, services, and capital?
And one last question right in front of you, and then we do have to wrap up.
Thank you. Thanks for the very interesting speech. I'm a freelance writer from Prague, Czech Republic, so Central Europe. Wouldn't you think, Mr. Krastev, that nevertheless the situation of different countries called today Central Eastern Europe is very different? And the Czechs is different than Poland and Hungary or Romania. Just one example, we the Czechs do not have at all any problem with exodus. There is zero exodus to the West, so the situation is very much different. Second, is it maybe a bit more complicated in the sense that even within each country, it depends on social groups, on social levels. We speak about Poland. Mr. Kaczynski is in power, has been in power since 3 years, but he didn't get more than 37% of votes. So with 50% of frequentation, which means that nobody can say that Polish, as majority or as a people, voted against liberal values. On the contrary, it's quite clear that after 8 years of a government, they wanted to change. And third question, and this is what you said a bit, Central and Eastern Europe, maybe we should agree, or shouldn't we agree, that there was always some process of imitation of the West. Since Roman Empire, since Versailles, since Paris, etc., the mode, the fashion. So what about it? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll start with the easiest to answer about the different countries being different, because here comes my favorite Swiss joke, which I always like to say. And this is the story of 3 boys, 8, 9-year-old, German, French, and Swiss, discussing where the baby comes from. And the German boy said they're coming from the sky, and the parents find them in front of the door. And the French boy said, this is ridiculous, they come from the bedroom. But then the Swiss boy became very nervous, and he said, do not generalize. It's different from canton to canton. And I do believe that in Central and Eastern Europe, it's different from canton to canton. You're right, for the last 30 years, only 4% of there are 2 countries, basically Slovenia and Czech Republic, which basically do not suffer exodus. Even more, these countries are also very different when you see, for example, religious nature of the Polish society, very much discussed. One of the society with a high level of people going regularly to church. The most secular society in Europe is the Czech one. 70% basically declare themselves as secular or agnostic. So from this point of view, normally I always start, and sorry for not saying this, is that Central Europe is a big metaphor. There is 3 things out of the common communist past which nevertheless are interesting. One is the fact that, talking about Klimt, which Heda did so beautifully. In the beginning of the 20th century, when he talks about the ethnic composition of societies, there were 2 Europes. One was ethnically quite homogeneous, and this was Western Europe. The other was much more culturally diverse, and this was Habsburg Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. After World War II, as a result of the movement of people, expulsion of population, and so on, this dramatically changed. Today, we have again 2 Europes. One is ethnically homogeneous, and this is Central and Eastern Europe. And the other is much more ethnically and culturally diverse, and this is Western Europe. Just give you 2 figures. In 1939, 1/3 of the population of Poland were not Poles. There were Jews, there were Germans, there were Ukrainians. Now, basically, more than 95% of the population of Poland are ethnic Poles. If you compare Austria and Hungary, 2 countries next to each other, similar size, being part of the same country before. At the moment, 14% of the Austrian citizens were not born in Austria. This is percent higher than in the United States. In Hungary, only 4% of the citizens of Hungary are not born in Hungary, and all of them are Hungarians, basically being born either in Serbia or in Romania. So from this point of view, I do believe this kind of ethnic homogeneity issue matters. The level of urbanization matters a lot, and this puts, for example, countries like Czech Republic and Bulgaria in a totally different position. In 1945, Czechoslovakia then was urbanized and modernized society. In Bulgaria, 80% of the population was living in the rural areas. So from this point of view, and by the way, there is a strong correlation between the level of urbanization in which you entered the communist period and the number of the people who left the country after 1989. Because for many of the East Europeans, basically we have been living our countries in the way our parents were living the rural areas and going to the cities. And during the communism, this was also kind of a social promotion and social lift. So then basically going from there and being asked to come for what I expect to happen, probably because I come from the political science, I'm not afraid when something is contested. I'm afraid when something is not contested. When everybody is for the European Union, I'm nervous. Because politics is not based on things that people totally agree with. So from this point of view, I found much more healthy some of the processes that happens, because if you see how the imitation gets recognition and legitimacy, this is through rebelling. You're rebelling in order after that to adopt. And this is always, in a certain way, it is because of this rebellion, then you start to claim that this same, for example, constitution that you defended then, you didn't make the changes simply because the European Union asked you, but because there were people on the streets defending this constitution against certain contest. The real problem is when in some countries it is difficult through the democratic process to do it, and this is, I see the problem with Hungary, where basically you have the hijack of the democratic system. This is why about Poland, I do believe it is. Listen, there are many governments that we don't like in the world. Normally, I have been living in a country that I don't like. Normally, the governments I have been voting for. So from this point of view, I do believe this is how democracy works. And concerning about borders, no. Having control on the borders does not mean that national governments are going to do it. But pretending that the borders are kind of ill-defined places is something that I don't believe that it can go. There was Kenjawit, very interesting, idiosyncratic American political professor who wrote an important book in the 1990s. He was talking about 3 different versions of borders. He said once he's calling it a frontier. He said this is like a singles bar. You go, you meet a girl, you have a one-night stand, you don't remember the name, no identity being built. And some of the globalization borders is that these borders that does not matter to you. And then he said they're borders like barricades. Like Catholic marriage, he said. No divorce. And these borders create a huge identities, but they're becoming problematic. In a certain way, we need borders that create identities, but at the same borders that are flexible and that can be renegotiated and so on. So from this point of view, I don't believe that hard borders means borders who are not allowing immigrants to come, but it means the borders that can be opened and that can be closed. And from this point of view, if you go to the history of the United States, the classical immigrant society, it was never a society with simply open borders. It was opening and closing of the borders. Because at a certain point, you need to digest, to integrate, basically to try to create a social cohesion. And this I found kind of historically, and there is a historian, something that works like this. And then basically the idea, your question about speed Europe, 3-level Europe, and so on. My usual joke is when in 2009 President Barroso started to invite people to talk about the crisis, and there was, of course, East European quota, so this is why I also landed up there. And he was saying what you can do for us. And I said, not much, because I'm not specialist on European integration. I'm specialist on disintegration. Professionally, I have been doing how things collapse. And there is 2 things that I have learned from Soviet and Yugoslav collapse. First is that the moment you start to dream about optimal union, you never know how it's going to end up. It's easy to say that you're going to have core and periphery, but the moment when basically somebody said, listen, if the East Europeans, Hungarian Poles are not part of the core, we can consolidate the Eurozone only, Italy comes. So it's not that you have the problem in certain countries. The problem that European Union is facing and all this reinvention goes through every of the member states. And the second thing that I learned is it's never periphery that destroyed big political projects. It was not the Baltics that destroyed the Soviet Union. They ran away, but in a certain way, this was what they have been interested to do all the time. It was the moment when the Russian Federation decided that Soviet Union is not in their interest, exactly because they decided to go for an optimal union with Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, that the Soviet Union collapsed. So from my point of view, one of the most dangerous things in the European integration process is there a risk that the center, particularly Germany, is going to decide that European Union is so dysfunctional and badly functioning, so it's going to be much more in the German interest, basically, to get out of it. And I do believe that we are not at this level, but at the same time, I do believe that this type of adjustments that we're talking about are going to be critical to have a European Union that is functional and liberal at the same time. Because many of the politicians who today are challenging the European Union, and this is my last point, and this is kind of, for some people, it's going to sound optimistic. For me, it's much more worrying, is now in Europe, you do not have a major party, including on the far right, who is an exit party. You had an exit parties in 2017. Mrs. Le Pen openly was saying, let's get out of the euro. You have getting out of the euro parties in other countries. Now nobody wants to get out of the euro and nobody wants to go out of the European Union. Everybody wants a different European Union. And people have a different idea of what different is. I find this much more difficult politically because it's much easier to fight a battle when somebody is pro-European Union and others sees his country out of the European Union than this type of a vague border between being for and against. For example, the Macron strategy of the presidential elections cannot work on this European election exactly because there is no exit party. He cannot say, I'm for Europe, and these people want to destroy European Union or to leave European Union, and this is not going to look as credible as it was there. So from this point of view, in my view, European Union simply should try to adjust to this situation, allow for the Central Europeans to regain their kind of a confidence, fighting their domestic fights and helping them. But at the same time, it's going to take time. And it's an open-ended story. It's going to be up to luck, to political leadership, to the general kind of a global environment which also exists, and the European Union is not living in the world of its own. But I don't believe that there is an institutional solution which is the magic bullet which is going to solve all the problems that the Union is facing. So this is as optimistic as a Bulgarian can deliver.
I think an open-ended and optimistic phrase is the best place to finish. Thank you very much, Ivan, and thank you very much, Heather and Jorg, for your discussion.